The rented room. No one could bear to sleep in. There are stories whispered in towns, rumors that pass from mouth to mouth like a dark secret that refuses to die. Among them, few carry the weight and strangeness of the tale of a room. An ordinary room at first glance, but one that no tenant could bear to stay in for long. It was known among locals as the rented room that no one could sleep in. The building itself was not extraordinary. Nestled on the corner of a quiet street, the house stood with an old-fashioned charm that might have once been inviting. Its brick walls had dulled with time, and ivy crept up one side, wrapping the structure like green veins crawling toward the roof. The owner, a middle-aged man named Richard, was practical and always looking for a way to supplement his income. Renting out rooms had been his solution. Yet, despite the central location and modest price, one particular room remained vacant far more often than it was occupied. It wasn't because it was smaller or darker than the others. On the contrary, it had a wide window that overlooked the street and a soft wooden floor polished to a golden shine. But every person who tried to rent it never lasted more than a few nights. Some left abruptly, abandoning personal belongings. Others refused to speak in detail about what they experienced, mumbling excuses about bad vibes or insomnia as they quickly packed their things. At first, Richard thought it was all nonsense. He didn't believe in the supernatural, and he chalked it up to picky tenants or bad luck. Yet as the pattern continued, unease began to gnaw at him. Each time someone left in haste, he would enter the room afterward, searching for anything unusual. He found nothing. No foul smell, no broken pipes, no strange drafts. The space was immaculate, but the silence that hung there always seemed heavier than in the rest of the house. Neighbors began to notice the revolving door of tenants. Whispers spread, giving the room a reputation that made it even harder to rent. Richard, however, refused to accept defeat. He lowered the price, advertised widely, and even slept there himself one night to prove it was safe. He made it until morning, though the sleep he managed was restless, broken by odd dreams that faded like smoke as soon as he woke. He dismissed it as suggestion. Perhaps the rumors had seeded the unease in his own mind. But then came Clara. She was a young student, quiet and polite, who seemed grateful for the affordable rent. Unlike others, she did not seem easily swayed by local gossip. Richard explained the rules of the house, handed her the key, and thought little more of it. For 2 nights, everything appeared normal. Clara went about her routine, attending classes during the day and returning late in the evening. But on the 3rd night, Richard was startled by the sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the hallway at an hour when the house should have been silent. When he opened his door, he saw Clara standing pale and trembling at the top of the stairs. Her suitcase was half-zipped, clothes spilling out as she clutched it in shaking hands. Richard tried to calm her down, asking what had happened. Clara's lips quivered as she whispered, "Something is wrong with that room. I can't stay there. I can't sleep, not with it watching." Richard pressed her for details, but Clara only shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. Within minutes she was gone, vanishing into the night, never to return. That incident marked a turning point for Richard. He could no longer ignore the strange pattern. What had Clara seen? What had driven her out with such terror? And what was it? The presence she had spoken of with such dread. The room stood empty again, as if it resisted human presence, as if it belonged not to Richard or any tenant, but to something else entirely. And so, the legend of the rented room grew darker, waiting for the next soul brave, or foolish, enough to try and sleep within its walls. Richard could not erase Clara's terrified face from his mind. The way her words trembled, "I can't sleep, not with it watching," had burrowed into his thoughts like a splinter he could not remove. He told himself there had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps she had suffered from a nightmare, or she was prone to anxiety. But deep down, he felt something more sinister lurking in the silence of that room. After Clara's departure, Richard avoided the room for several days. He passed by the closed door in the hallway, pretending not to notice the way it seemed to loom heavier than the others. It was ridiculous, he thought, to fear a room in his own house. And yet, whenever his gaze lingered on the brass doorknob, he felt as though someone, was waiting just beyond it, listening to his hesitation. Eventually, his curiosity won. Armed with nothing but his skepticism and a flashlight, Richard opened the door late one night. The air inside felt different, cooler, denser, as if the space was sealed from the rest of the house. He scanned the room carefully. The neatly made bed, the wooden dresser, the curtains swaying faintly despite the closed window. Nothing out of place. Yet the longer he stood there, the stronger the sensation grew that he was intruding, that he was being observed. Determined not to be swayed by imagination, Richard decided to spend the night there again. He stretched out on the bed, closed his eyes, and forced himself to relax. For hours, sleep toyed with him but never fully arrived. His body grew heavy, his thoughts muddled, but something kept pulling him back to wakefulness. Each time he drifted off, he felt a shift in the atmosphere, like the faint weight of a shadow leaning closer. Around 3 in the morning, he heard it. A soft creak from the corner of the room, as if a footstep had pressed against the old floorboards. His eyes shot open, scanning the dimly lit room. Nothing moved, yet his heart hammered violently. He tried to reason with himself. The house is old, wood expands, that's all it is. But then came another sound, this time unmistakable. A whisper, low and hushed, curling through the darkness. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Someone was speaking inside the room. Richard bolted upright, the flashlight trembling in his hand as he swept its beam across the walls. Empty. The chair in the corner sat undisturbed. The curtains fluttered gently, though the window was shut tight. The sound had vanished, but the room seemed heavier now, pressing against his chest. He barely lasted another hour before fleeing back to his own bedroom, locking the door behind him. In the days that followed, Richard became obsessed. He questioned neighbors again, hoping someone could give him an explanation. Some only shook their heads while others avoided the topic entirely. Finally, an elderly woman who lived across the street shared what little she knew. "That house, it's old," she said in a low voice. "Before you owned it, it belonged to the Kellers, and before them, a widow named Margaret. They say her son died in that very room many years ago. Some say she never left after him. Others say it was the boy who lingered, unable to rest." Richard's skepticism faltered. Could the tragedies of the past have left a mark, an echo that refused to fade? He found himself returning to the room repeatedly, standing in the doorway and listening. Sometimes he thought he caught faint sounds, a sigh, a shuffle, or the almost inaudible rhythm of breathing. Then came the new tenant, Daniel. He was a traveler, pragmatic and cheerful, who laughed off Richard's half-hearted warnings. "I've slept in worse places," Daniel joked, hauling his backpack into the infamous room. For the first 2 nights, everything seemed fine. Richard dared to believe perhaps the curse of the room was nothing more than rumor after all. But on the 3rd night, the same point when Clara had fled, Richard was awoken again by commotion. This time it was not hurried footsteps but a scream. A raw, guttural cry that tore through the silence of the house. Richard rushed toward the sound, his heart pounding, only to find Daniel standing in the hallway, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "I saw her," Daniel whispered hoarsely. "There was a woman standing over the bed. She was watching me." Richard stared at him, speechless. Daniel's voice broke as he continued. "She was pale. Her face..." He stopped abruptly, shaking his head as though afraid to describe it further. Without another word, he gathered his belongings and fled into the night, just as Clara had. And once again the room fell silent. Daniel's scream lingered in Richard's ears long after the traveler had vanished into the night. The words, "She was standing over the bed," echoed in his mind like a broken record. Clara had spoken of it, watching her. Now Daniel had given the figure a face, a woman. Pale, silent, watching. For the first time, Richard truly feared the room in his own house. Until then, he had tried to rationalize every incident as a trick of the imagination. But 2 tenants, different in background and temperament, had experienced something eerily similar. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The room was more than unlucky. It was alive with something unseen, something unwilling to let others rest. Richard's curiosity, however, was as strong as his fear. He spent hours in the local library, digging into the property's history. Old newspapers, yellowed with age, revealed fragments of forgotten tragedies. The house, built in the early 1900s, had indeed belonged to a widow named Margaret Keller. She had lost her only son Thomas to a sudden illness. The boy had been confined to bed for weeks in what was now the rented room. He was just 12 years old when he died. Accounts from neighbors described Margaret as inconsolable. Rumor had it she spent her final years in that same room, rocking in a chair, staring at the empty bed, as though waiting for her son to return. She died there too, decades later, found seated upright as if still keeping vigil. The story was tragic, but tragedy alone couldn't explain the experiences of his tenants. Richard wondered, was it the boy's spirit, lost and restless? Or Margaret herself, unable to release her grief? The idea unsettled him, yet he couldn't help but feel that the room had absorbed their sorrow, festering over the years into something darker. That night, Richard decided to face it directly. He entered the room at midnight with only a lamp for company. He set a chair in the corner and forced himself to sit, determined to observe whatever might happen. Hours passed in silence, the kind that made every creak and sigh of the old house feel like a deliberate sound. He tried to keep his eyes open, but fatigue dragged at him. His head dipped once, twice, and then, suddenly, the lamp flickered. The shadows deepened unnaturally. Richard straightened, heart thudding. In the reflection of the mirror across the room, he thought he saw movement, something faint, shifting near the bed. He turned sharply, but the space was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the surface seemed darker, almost as if it were holding a depth beyond its glass. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw the outline of a woman, slender, draped in black, standing just behind him. He spun around, pulse hammering, but the room was still. The only sound was his own labored breathing. The sensation of being observed grew unbearable, pressing against his skin like invisible eyes. At last, unable to withstand it, Richard fled, slamming the door behind him. From then on, he avoided the room entirely. He no longer tried to rent it out. He locked the door and left it that way, as though sealing in whatever presence lingered there. But rumors spread faster than silence. Neighbors noticed the room was permanently shut, and whispers grew wilder. Some said a ghostly woman roamed the house. Others claimed a curse clung to the walls. Months passed. Richard convinced himself he had done the right thing by leaving the room alone. That is, until one evening when a knock came at the door. It was a young couple, Emma and Michael, searching desperately for a place to stay. They had little money, and when Richard explained he had no available rooms, they begged him to reconsider. Out of guilt, and perhaps a hidden desire to prove to himself that the curse was only in his imagination, he unlocked the forbidden room and rented it to them, without mentioning its history. The first night was quiet. The second, unease set in. By the third, Richard found himself pacing, waiting for the inevitable. At precisely 3 a.m, the sound returned. Footsteps in the hallway, soft but deliberate. He rushed out, and there stood Emma, clutching her arms, pale as chalk. "She's in there," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "She's sitting in the chair, watching us sleep." Behind her, Michael appeared, shaken but angry. "This isn't funny," he growled at Richard. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Before Richard could answer, the couple stormed past him, leaving the house with the same urgency as all the others. The room swallowed its silence once again, and Richard realized something horrifying. Each time someone stayed, the presence grew stronger, bolder. It no longer confined itself to whispers and shadows. Now it appeared, clearly, undeniably. And the worst thought of all crept into Richard's mind like poison. What if one night, it left the room entirely? The night after Emma and Michael fled, Richard did not sleep at all. He sat in his kitchen, the dim glow of a single bulb casting sharp shadows across the walls. His mind raced, replaying Emma's words over and over. "She's sitting in the chair watching us sleep." It was no longer just fleeting impressions or vague feelings. Tenants now described a figure with certainty, a woman, always watching. Richard's house no longer felt like his own. He avoided the upstairs hallway, shunning the locked door as though something might slip through the crack if he lingered too long. Yet despite his fear, part of him still longed to understand. Who was she? Margaret, the grieving widow, or something else, something darker wearing a familiar face? One stormy evening, as rain battered the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, Richard's unease peaked. He swore he heard faint movements from the locked room. A chair scraping against wood, the soft creak of footsteps pacing back and forth. But no one was inside. The door was bolted, the key tucked away in his pocket. Still, the noises persisted, rising and falling like restless breathing. That night, Richard dreamed, or perhaps believed he dreamed, of standing inside the room. The furniture was gone, the walls bare. In the center stood the bed, and on it lay a figure covered with a thin sheet. Slowly, the sheet shifted, rising with the rhythm of breath. Richard moved closer, dread filling his chest. When he reached for the sheet, the figure beneath sat up suddenly. A woman's pale face stared at him with hollow eyes. Her lips parted, and in a whisper that scraped like broken glass, she murmured, "Stay." Richard woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, his ears still echoing with the sound of her voice. It felt too vivid to be a dream, too real. Desperation led him to confide in Father O'Malley, a priest from a nearby parish. The priest listened patiently as Richard recounted the history of the room and the experiences of his tenants. O'Malley's expression grew grave. "Sometimes," he said softly, "grief leaves an imprint so strong it refuses to fade. But grief, left untended, can twist into something else, resentment, anger, even malice. If this woman lingers, it may not be as the soul she once was, but as something far more dangerous." The priest offered to bless the house, and Richard agreed. Holy water was sprinkled, prayers were spoken, but as the rituals filled the rooms, Richard noticed something unsettling. The air grew heavier, colder when they neared the locked door. The priest pressed his palm against the wood and shuddered. "There is resistance here," he murmured. "This spirit does not want to leave." That night, Richard dared to hope the blessing had worked. Hours passed in silence, but at exactly 3 in the morning, he woke to a sound that chilled him to the bone. The slow, deliberate creak of his bedroom door opening. He froze, his eyes wide in the darkness. The door stood ajar, though he had locked it before bed. From the hallway came the faint shuffle of footsteps, soft, dragging, moving toward his room. With trembling hands, Richard reached for the lamp and flicked it on. The hallway was empty. But just before he slammed the door shut, he glimpsed something at the far end. The door to the rented room, which he had bolted earlier, now stood wide open. The entity was no longer confined. In the following days, Richard's house became unbearable. Objects shifted on their own. Chairs scraped across the floor. Doors opened and closed with sharp bangs. At night, whispers threaded through the walls, sometimes speaking words Richard could almost understand. Once, while washing dishes, he caught his reflection in the kitchen window, and behind him, faint but clear, stood a woman with hollow eyes. He spun around, but the kitchen was empty. Sleep abandoned him entirely. Each night he lay awake, the shadows around him thickening, waiting. He began to dread the coming of 3 a.m., the hour when the atmosphere grew stifling, as though the house itself held its breath. More than once, he heard his name spoken in the dark. Richard, drawn out like a sigh, slithering into his ears. The final straw came one night when Richard awoke to find himself unable to move. His body was paralyzed, pinned to the bed by an unseen force. Panic surged through him as his eyes darted wildly, searching the room. At the foot of the bed, the air shimmered, condensing into a form. She was there, the woman. Her long black dress clung to her thin frame, her pale face illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. She did not blink. She only stared, unblinking, her lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo inside his skull, she whispered again, "Stay." Richard lay frozen, his chest heaving as though an invisible weight pressed him into the mattress. The woman's pale face hovered at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes locked onto his. He wanted to scream, but his throat tightened, strangled by fear. When her lips moved again, the sound was not a whisper this time. It was a command, sharp and guttural, echoing in the air like a chorus of voices layered into one. Stay. The paralysis broke suddenly, and Richard lurched upright, gasping for air. The apparition was gone, the room empty once more, but the echo of that voice clung to the walls like smoke. He stumbled from his bedroom, trembling violently, and collapsed into the living room chair. The house was no longer a place of safety. It had become a prison, a cage shared with something that was growing stronger by the night. Sleep-deprived and desperate, Richard turned to research again. He scoured books on hauntings, restless spirits, and the nature of curses. A chilling pattern emerged. Many accounts described entities that began as echoes of grief, but fed on fear, slowly warping into malevolent forces. What had once been Margaret's sorrow could have twisted over decades into something far darker, something that no longer resembled the woman at all. As the days bled together, Richard noticed the presence extending beyond the room. Neighbors reported seeing a figure in his upstairs window when they knew he wasn't home. Delivery drivers claimed they heard a woman's laughter near the porch. Even his closest friend refused to visit after sensing something watching the last time he stepped inside. The house, once merely haunted, was now shunned. Richard thought of selling the property, of abandoning it entirely, but something deep inside him resisted. A part of him felt bound to the house, as though leaving it behind would not free him. The voice, the command, "Stay," echoed in his mind day and night. It was not just the house she wanted, it was him. One evening, determined to confront the presence directly, Richard set up a camera in the rented room. He locked the door behind him and left it recording overnight, hoping for evidence he could not deny. The next morning, with trembling hands, he reviewed the footage. For hours, nothing appeared, just an empty room. But at exactly 3 o'clock, the screen flickered. The chair in the corner shifted slightly, rocking as though someone had sat in it. Then faintly, a shadow lengthened across the floor, though no light source explained it. Seconds later, the camera caught it, the faint outline of a woman forming in the chair. Her face was obscured at first, blurred by static until she slowly lifted her head. Hollow eyes glared directly into the lens, and then, in a voice that distorted the audio into a screech, she said the word Richard had come to dread. "Stay." Richard slammed the laptop shut, his pulse hammering. But the damage was done. He knew now that she was real, undeniable, and worse, she was aware of him watching. That night, the knocking began. Soft at first, 3 slow taps on the walls. Then louder, moving through the house, echoing from the ceiling, the doors, the floor beneath his feet. Richard covered his ears, but the sound only grew more insistent. At last, it stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it felt suffocating. He opened his eyes, and in the reflection of the darkened window, he saw her standing behind him. He spun around. Nothing. Yet the window's reflection still showed her, closer now, her mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. Richard no longer questioned whether she was Margaret or something else. She was not simply a ghost. She was a predator, feeding on every ounce of terror she could wring from him. And he feared that if he didn't find a way to escape her grip soon, he would become just another shadow bound to that cursed room, another restless soul trapped forever. The thought chilled him. Maybe that was why no one could sleep in the room. Because she wasn't just watching. She was waiting. Richard was unraveling. Nights had become indistinguishable from nightmares, days heavy with dread. He no longer opened the rented room, no longer dared to walk the hallway after dark. But the presence no longer needed the room. It followed him everywhere, seeping into every corner of the house. It was no longer confined. It had claimed the entire space. One night, unable to endure the suffocating silence, Richard packed a bag. He told himself he would leave, abandon the house and never return. But as he dragged his suitcase down the stairs, a sudden weight settled over the air. The lights flickered, then died, leaving him in utter darkness. From upstairs came the unmistakable sound of the chair creaking, slow, deliberate, as though someone had just sat down. Richard froze, his grip on the suitcase handle tightening. Then came the voice, drifting through the dark, closer than ever before. "Stay." The air grew cold, his breath clouding in front of him. A shape materialized at the bottom of the staircase, a silhouette tall and thin, her dress black as ink. Richard's courage shattered. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own suitcase. The woman descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing like a hammer in his chest. Her face, pale and hollow, seemed less human now, more a mask stretched too thin over emptiness. When she reached the bottom, she stopped just a few feet from him. Her hand, skeletal and trembling, lifted as if to touch his face. Richard gasped, his body trembling violently. And then, for the first time, she spoke more than a single word. Her voice was a chorus of whispers, layered and fractured. "You are mine now." Richard screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, but the house swallowed it whole. What happened after remains uncertain. Some say neighbors heard cries that night, followed by silence. Others claim the house grew darker, its windows clouded as though shadow had seeped into the glass itself. Weeks passed before anyone entered again. Authorities found the home abandoned. Richard was gone, his belongings scattered, his suitcase toppled by the stairs, but the rented room's door stood wide open. Inside, the chair rocked gently, though no wind stirred. On the dresser sat Richard's wallet and keys, as if left behind in surrender. No one has lived in the house since. Locals crossed the street to avoid walking too close, whispering warnings to strangers. Don't rent the room. No one ever lasts. And at night, some claim they see a figure in the upstairs window, a pale woman, always watching, waiting for the next soul to enter. The story of the rented room is more than just a tale of a haunting. It is a reminder of how grief, left unresolved, can grow into something monstrous. Pain unspoken, loss unhealed. It lingers, warping into chains that bind not only the dead, but the living as well. The house, the room, and Richard himself became prisoners of a sorrow that twisted into hunger, into darkness. And perhaps the scariest truth of all is this: sometimes, what we fear is not the ghost of another, but the reflection of our own despair, the part of us that refuses to let go. So remember, when you hear whispers in the night or feel unseen eyes upon you, ask yourself, are they watching from the shadows? Or are they echoes of something you've carried within all along? The moral is simple, yet chilling. What we fail to confront in life can haunt us forever. Thank you for watching this video. We kindly ask that you subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, activate the notification bell so you'll be alerted whenever we post. See you in the next video.